HADC is for us to have these conversations more frequently so that it becomes a conversation amongst colleagues and peers and not one where I've been waiting for you for 3 years to ask this question and now I'm going to put you on the spot. We work together, and the goal is for us to each year have more and more of the suppliers, and so that the hub agri-dealers in particular get to better understand what their constraints are and they yours, so that we can actually together, again, we're talking about 22, 25 kg per hectare is what our average farmers are using compared to 135 kg per hectare in other parts of the world. We've got lots of work to do that would benefit both suppliers and hubs if we're working collaboratively. The next session that we want to have, colleagues, is really on a key overview point that we wanted to share with you, which is the status of fertilizer and the soil health sector in Africa. That session will be chaired and moderated by Mr. James Mutoni. I'd like to invite him to come to the stage. I will just mention James's panel, but then he can also give further insight. Dr. Oluwole Fatumbe, also from FARA. Dr. Lizo Vies, who is an expert on soil health with a number of different institutions, including support with AFAP. Dr. Maria Wanzala, who is the Vice President Policy for AFAP. And DG Rob, I really don't want to mess up his name, so Dr. Ndaba Menye. We haven't given him any rest. He went from the morning sessions to press release, and DG, we're calling upon you once again. I'm sorry. I'll turn it over to you, James.
Thank you so much, Michael. I've been introduced, James Mutoni, AFAP, Country Director for Kenya. And we shall be having a discussion on the status of fertilizer and soil health. I think it's timely. This conference is timely, coming out soon after the African Fertilizer and Soil Health Summit that was held last month in Nairobi. And we're also a bit excited because the discussion has changed. It's no longer about fertilizer use and increased productivity, but it's now more of a discussion about fertilizer and soil health management, because the two have now been recognized as the issues and the key issues that will drive the food sector in Africa. And we're not just talking about fertilizers as the mineral fertilizers. I know we've been talking about Indorama and Yaras, but then we're also talking about the organic fertilizers. And some of the key organic fertilizer companies are represented here as well. And it goes beyond even the organic fertilizers. We are now bringing into the discussion issues of technology and how all these things can be brought together to bring about a very vibrant fertilizer industry. Looking back, we've been informed about Abuja 2006. And then 17 years later, we have the African Soil Health Summit in Kenya. But then if you look at the literature, it just talks about marginal increase. Yes, we've made the steps, we've seen the steps, but they're still marginal. And we have our colleague even from the African Development Bank who mentioned here the amount of money Africa is using to import fertilizer, and even our fertilizer use. And the issue is marginal. And so we are asking ourselves, where are the key issues? Of course, we know what they are. The key issues are known. We know the key issues, the challenges. But I think what we should be driving at more is, now how do we partner to resolve this? We know about the status of our soil. We've been talked about the finance of fertilizers, the problem of access, the problem of pricing. But then we're all seated in this room. We can't lament. And so how do we create partnerships that we can foster that now we can bring about actually no longer marginal, we should not be talking about marginal, but substantive change so that we have increased food production in Africa. So I have a panel of experts with me. People will enlighten us about the issues. I'll call them to stage and they'll make some presentations. I'll start with Dr. Maria Wanzala, who is Vice President of Policy at the African Fertilizer and Agribusiness Partnership. She's my colleague. She's based out in Johannesburg. Welcome, Maria. We have Dr. Leslie Wise, I also consider as a colleague, Fertilizer African Soil Health Advisor, also TSG, working very closely with AFAP. She'll also give some brief remarks and presentation on the status of soil health. We have Dr. Oluwale Fatumbi, I hope I have that right, Acting Director of Research and Innovation, Forum for Agriculture Research in Africa. Again, we are overworking you. He'll also give us some insights because we're talking about the African Soil Health Summit. And I know some of us were there, but some of us may not have been there. And so what are the key things that will be driving us in that regard? Or what are the takeaways? And finally, I have Dr. Telsfonse Ndembayema. Ndembamenye. Yeah. Director General for Rwanda Agricultural and Animal Resource Development Board. We will also, I think, he's partially our host, but we're also making him, we are, like my CEO said, we are actually overworking him. So thank you very much. I think I'll come over. I think some of you have presentations, but I'll go straight over as I come to take my seat to Dr. Maria Wanzala. Maria Wanzala, maybe you can give us some insights onto the status of fertilizer sector in Kenya. I mean, in Africa. Sorry about that, yeah. You want to use the mic?
Yeah, I'll come and speak on that since others are making presentations.
All right, since most of us are making presentations, Maria Wanzala will speak from here as well. Huh? All right, Karibu.
Thank you, James. Oops, sorry. Okay, so my brief is to give you an overview of the status of the fertilizer markets in sub-Saharan Africa. So I will jump right into it. I would say that there have undeniably been improvements in the status of the fertilizer markets in the continent, particularly since the Abuja Declaration in 2006, especially with regards to private sector investment and engagement in these markets, and also increases in fertilizer production. Nevertheless, we still have a long way to go, particularly when we talk in terms of increasing consumption and then just general market conditions. So I will just give you a brief report on status by category. So the first category is fertilizer consumption. It's definitely the case that over the past 20 years, fertilizer consumption levels in Africa have increased both in terms of application rate per hectare as well as overall fertilizer consumption. In terms of consumption, current consumption is at approximately 15 million metric tons per annum, up from approximately 8 million metric tons in 2006, so it has essentially doubled, but this is only equivalent to 3% of total world consumption. In terms of average application rates, they have also doubled. They are currently at approximately 18 to 20 kilograms per hectare, which is double the average of 8 kilograms per hectare that we were facing in 2006. Nevertheless, again, these consumption levels are way below the world average of 135 kilograms per hectare, and for the majority of countries, they are actually way below the Abuja target of 50 kilograms per hectare. So it is important to point out that these use levels are essentially still insufficient to really replace the soil nutrients that we lose every year from the soils through harvesting, and there's really an urgent need to accelerate fertilizer use in Africa in order to reach the North Star that we've heard about repeatedly, food security for the continent. In terms of fertilizer production, Africa produces about 30 million metric tons of fertilizer per annum, but again, this only accounts for about 4% of world production. Furthermore, production of this fertilizer is concentrated in only 6 countries, 4 of which are in North Africa, Algeria, Egypt, Morocco, and Tunisia. The other major producers are Nigeria and South Africa. However, there have been notably large investments to increase production capacity, particularly in Nigeria and Morocco, and there's also been an increase in the number of blending operations in sub-Saharan Africa. So in Nigeria, the private sector has invested over $4 billion to increase urea capacity, which is now sitting at about 6.5 million metric tons, and OCP is now producing over 14 million tons of phosphate fertilizers annually. Furthermore, over 140 blending plants are located across sub-Saharan Africa, and there are also 15 to 20 organic fertilizer plants across the continent. So we've definitely made strides in terms of production capacity. However, if we now turn to fertilizer trade, despite these increases in production, the majority of these fertilizers that are produced are exported from the continent. They're not being marketed to sub-Saharan Africa. Conversely, 90% of the fertilizer that is consumed on the continent is imported from outside the continent as a finished product. In comparison, we can see that 75% of the fertilizer consumed in Latin America is imported, and in South Asia, it's only 20 to 30%. If we look at taxes and tariffs on fertilizers, while most of our countries have removed import tariffs on fertilizers, mainly guided by the call of the Abuja Declaration to make fertilizer a commodity without borders. However, we still see that about 1/3 of our countries still have import duties on fertilizers, and about half of them still have some form of tax levy on fertilizers and fertilizer-related services. Most notably, the majority of countries charge VAT of up to 18% on transportation, as well as materials that are used for fertilizers, such as bagging. And it's important because these taxes and fees do add to the final farm gate price of fertilizer that is faced by our farmers. Turning to fertilizer prices, since over 90% of the fertilizer that is consumed in the continent is imported, it's only natural that the FOB, or world market price, would be a major component of the price that is paid by our farmers, accounting for about 60 to 70% of the farm gate price. However, even though prices on the world market have come down substantially, especially in the last quarter of 2023, fertilizer prices in Africa are still triple or double the prices in the rest of the world. For example, in March of 2024, the FOB price of urea on the world market was around $300 to $350 per ton, while in Mozambique, the retail price was at $850 per ton. In Zambia, it was sitting at $800 per ton, Kenya just over $700, and in Ghana, over $1,000 per ton. The reasons for these high prices include very high cost or inefficient domestic marketing conditions, particularly local transportation, which can account for 14 to 20% of the farm gate price. Also the high cost of finance. We've talked about finance earlier today. But a key reason for these high prices today is the currency devaluations. Turning to fertilizer market sizes, the majority of countries in sub-Saharan Africa have a market size of less than 500,000 tons. So for example, from the sample of 17 countries for which data was available on fertilizer consumption from africafertilizer.org website, only 2 countries in Africa have markets of more than, in sub-Saharan Africa, of markets of more than 1 million tons, and that's Ethiopia and Nigeria. Of the rest of the countries, 3 countries have markets of less than 100,000 tons. That's Niger, Uganda, and Rwanda. 6 countries have markets of between 100,000 and 500,000 tons. 5 countries had markets of between 500,000 and 1 million tons. In comparison, Bangladesh, just one country alone, consumes more than 5 million tons of fertilizer per annum. So we still do have quite a way to go. In terms of development of agro-dealer networks, at least 1/3 of the countries have increased the density of the networks. They now have at least over 500 agro-dealers in rural areas to meet the needs of their farmers. And as a result, the distance that farmers have to travel to access a bag of fertilizer in these countries has come down. It's less than 10 kilometers a farmer has to travel to buy a bag of fertilizer. So just to give some specific examples, between 2005 and 2016, the number of trained agro-dealers in Rwanda increased from 10 to more than 1,000. In Kenya, the number increased from about 1,200 to more than 7,000 agro-dealers. And in Ghana, the number increased from 2,300 to more than 4,000 agro-dealers. And these numbers have obviously increased since then. And as a result, the distance that farmers had to travel to buy a bag of fertilizer reduced on average from 24 kilometers to 8 kilometers. Nevertheless, the number of agro-dealers in the majority of countries is still too small to meet the needs of the farmers, and in many cases, farmers still have to travel at least 20 kilometers, and in some cases up to 100 kilometers just to buy a bag of fertilizer. And then in terms of the capacity of these agro-dealers, many still lack the basic marketing and business skills to meet the needs of their farmers. They also lack the technical knowledge that they would need to guide their farmers with regards to which fertilizers to use and how to use them properly. And then an additional weakness in terms of the agro-dealer networks is a low number of female agro-dealers, the exceptions being Uganda and Malawi. We can now turn to access to finance. As we have heard, we are now facing a crisis of some kind with regards to access to finance for the fertilizer trade. However, this is across the board in the agricultural sector. Access to finance is a key obstacle hindering growth of the agricultural sector in Africa. Specifically, although agriculture represents about 25% of the GDP, the share of lending by commercial banks to the sector is only about 4% in Ghana and Kenya, 6% in Uganda, and 12% in Tanzania. And this is exacerbated by high interest rates, which can be as high as 20 to 30%, and strict collateral requirements, which can be up to 150%. So this high cost of finance obviously restricts access to, the high cost of capital or finance restricts access to credit for fertilizer market players, which then becomes a major constraint with regards to availability of stocks for farmers. We now turn to fertilizer policy and regulatory frameworks. The majority of countries in sub-Saharan Africa do not have a standalone fertilizer policy to guide their fertilizer sectors. Only about a third of the countries have formal fertilizer policies, and the remaining two-thirds, the sector is guided by government decrees or ad hoc pronouncements, which obviously can change from year to year, which provides a very uncertain policy environment for the private sector. Similarly, the majority of countries do not have formal fertilizer regulations, and where they exist, they are either outdated or they are combined with legislation for other agrochemicals such as crop protection products and veterinary services. And then similarly, many countries do not have fertilizer standards to guide the sector, and this lack of standards is compounded by a very weak quality inspection infrastructure. And a key outcome of that is that we see a worrying trend of fertilizer quality issues in a number of African countries, which manifest as low nutrient levels, underweight bags, and incorrect labeling, adulteration. And this is important because then farmers lose their confidence in using this very expensive product, and then that translates into low use of fertilizers and then low yields. And then finally, fertilizer subsidies. The majority of countries in sub-Saharan Africa do have some type of input subsidy program in effect, and as a result, as much as 50% of the fertilizer that is consumed on the continent is subsidized to various degrees. And these programs can range from non-targeted universal subsidies, which are completely controlled by the government, to targeted programs with importation and distribution by the private sector. And then we see that input vouchers are the main mechanism that is used to target farmers, either in a paper form or in the form of e-vouchers. And then while these programs mainly feature fertilizers, increasingly they're also including seeds, good and agronomic practices, and crop protection products. So in summary, fertilizer markets in Africa, there have been undeniable improvements in terms of consumption rates, in terms of investments, in terms of participation of the private sector, but clearly we still have a long way to go in order to increase consumption levels. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria, for that presentation. I think a lot of us are pondering, and I have seen so many people already who would like to ask questions, but I think She has spoken, she has hit the nail on the head, and it's upon us to see how we can be able to work around some of these challenges. I now call upon Dr. Lisley, I was now also to give us a brief on status of soil health, the soil health landscape in Africa.
Thank you very much, James, and also Maria for that introduction to the session. I actually want to, while I'm waiting for the presentation, I want to, after listening to the first sessions this morning, I want to relate my presentation to some of what has been said this morning and really focus on the Hub Agro-Dealers in the context of soil health, since this is the Hub Agro-Dealer conference. And looking at the soil health landscape today, I think something that's been standing out for me over the last couple of years, but especially building up to the Africa Fertilizer and Soil Health Summit, and now after the summit, in the second session this morning, is how much more I hear the term soil health mentioned in general in the agricultural space, but also especially in the context of fertilizers. And this is it's not only because the summit was called the Fertilizer and Soil Health Summit, but I think from various corners around the world, and especially in Africa, there's been a much bigger understanding of the importance of having healthy soil and capable soils to ensure that the nutrients that we supply are available to the plants. And it was mentioned in the previous session as well, it's not just about feeding the soil, but it's about feeding the plants as well, which is ultimately what we're trying to achieve from an agricultural and production perspective. So, firstly, why is it important that we're looking at soil health in Africa? And you'll see on the red about 75% of the agricultural growth or production growth in Africa, at least in sub-Saharan Africa, was resulting from expansion of agricultural land or croplands into forest lands and rangelands. And many of you will know that in African agriculture, the rangelands and the forests are really important in terms of people's livelihoods and incomes as well. So we might expand the croplands for production, but we do that at the detriment of livestock production, rangelands, and also the value we get from forests. And we know that a lot of this expansion of croplands is because the soils in the croplands are degraded through nutrient mining. So there's a loss of nutrients in the soils because they're not replenished. There's a loss of organic matter. There's erosion. There's soil acidity that often increases as a result of production and so on. And what we also know is that the degradation of the soils reduces the effectiveness of any fertilizers that are applied. So in the fertilizer context and the supply context, if we supply fertilizers to farmers that have soils that are degraded and the efficiency of those fertilizers are low, that would result in lower profitability of the use of the fertilizers in terms of productivity and production, and that then can have an impact on the return of the farmers to those suppliers or hub agro-dealers if they don't see the value of applying the fertilizers in the first place. So it's really important to look at this as a holistic system with everything being connected. So I don't want to go through all the slides because I will run out of time. I just want to show this. There's a target for the whole continent based on Agenda 2063, aiming to have by last year, 2023, 30% of our agricultural land being sustainably managed, starting from 4.8% in 2013. But by the last reporting period was 2021, it was only up to 8.2%. And this correlates very well with the amount of soil that's degraded in croplands, just to show that we really need to look at our agricultural management practices that support soil health, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And I'm not going into a lot of technical detail because there will be the master classes, I think tomorrow and on Thursday as well, including on agroforestry and soil health and a lot of the practices that support soil health. So I just want to talk about the principles and why this is important. And in the African context, especially with the changing climate, Michael mentioned that this morning, that with more droughts and more floods and also erratic rainfall, farmers are much more at risk of damage to their crops, and dry seasons where, again, fertilizer application wouldn't be effective because you need water in the soil for fertilizers to be dissolved and so on. So just to look at this in terms of how does soil health support resilient agriculture on the continent. The definition for soil health, I think, doesn't really say very much. It says that the soil is always capable of functioning as a vital living ecosystem, not only to sustain plants, but also animals and humans that eat the plants coming from the soil. But again, if we look at that from a fertilizer perspective, there are a number of factors in the soil that can limit the effectiveness of fertilizer application. So related to soil organic matter, for example, that is very low. Some are inherent soil properties related to the type of clay and the amount of clay. Acidity, which is often inherent, but it can also be caused by management practices. Nutrient deficiencies, moisture, not enough water in the soil, compaction, and so on. But if we look at what that actually means, is if we look at this maize field, for example, our aim is to enhance crop growth and yield, and to have high yield of high quality, high nutritional value crops. So this starts with organic matter. This can be organic matter, organic inputs, composting and so on that can be applied from outside sources, but it also comes from the plant rests after harvesting. So it's really important to build up the organic matter in the soil, which then supports soil biology. The soil biology and the organic matter together are very important to improve the soil structure, especially in terms of very clay soils. It loosens up the soil a little bit. It makes the water more available. In sandy soils, it reduces the run through the infiltration into sandy soils and helps to keep the water in the root zone where the roots need to take up the nutrients from the soil water. It also increases all of this, the organic matter, the biology, the structure, all support soil to increase the water holding capacity. So when it rains or when there's irrigation, the water is able to infiltrate into the soil and it actually stays there. It doesn't necessarily infiltrate so quickly into the deeper layers, and if we also keep the soil covered, it doesn't evaporate so quickly when there are drier periods. And all of this, as I mentioned, water in the soil is essential for nutrients to be dissolved so that the plants can take it up. So all of this then improves nutrient availability, and that in turn then is available and enhances crop growth and yield. And I added acidity in brackets there because, again, if we think of external inputs, Sheila mentioned in the last session that urea as a source of nitrogen, for example, can also increase soil acidity. So in areas where soils are already acidic, that would not be an ideal source of nitrogen. And organic matter and others also help to buffer the acidity. So just briefly in terms of how we can improve soil health, I'll just talk again about the principles because there will be more in the master classes. But we need to look at keeping the soil covered, minimizing the soil disturbance, and then increasing the plant diversity through intercropping, cover crops, and so on. And for those that know conservation agriculture, those are the three principles of conservation agriculture. And then in addition to that, when we hear about regenerative agriculture, it also looks at maximizing the amount of time that there are live roots in the system, meaning that there are crops that are alive or plants that are alive. So that's also through cover crops and intercropping, and then integrating livestock. And I find the livestock one interesting because in many African smallholder systems, livestock is already integrated into crop production. It's just not necessarily done in a sustainable way because it often competes with the crop production for plant rests, for fodder and feed, and so on. So it doesn't necessarily support feeding the soil. And then very importantly, these are principles, and there are many practices that have been well tested and shown to improve soil health, but it's essentially to adapt them to the local context because each farmer's field and soil condition differs, the system and what farmers have available to them in terms of inputs, finance, everything else, the climate, the rainfall, all of this needs to be contextualized. There's no one size fits all for each farmer. And then again, coming back to climate, this is really essential in terms of the challenges that farmers are facing at the moment in terms of increased temperatures, erratic rainfall, extreme weather events. So it's really, especially in terms of water management, important to have soils that reduce the runoff by keeping them covered, making sure the water infiltrates into the soil when it rains, make sure that the water stays there when the temperatures rise, so there's shade over the soil, and making sure that the water stays in the root zone where the plants can use it. So this is the last slide. Again, thinking about the Hub Agro-Dealer context, I want you to just look at the graph where there's a red line at the bottom and a green line at the top. So the red line is for non-responsive soils, and this is not a scientific graph, it's just to explain the principal difference. So the green line is for responsive soils, so we could say healthy soils where applied fertilizer are effective. And this talks specifically about integrated soil fertility management. And I want to mention here as well, it's very important that this is not only in terms of mineral fertilizer application, but we know mineral fertilizers are also more effective when it's combined with organic inputs, whether it's, again, organic fertilizer or organic matter addition to the soil. So if we look at the current practice on the far left, and we change only fertilizers and improved seeds, because we heard that many agro-dealers also provide seeds, so it's part of your business. If it's only looking at applying or supplying fertilizer and improved seeds, there can be a big response, but much higher in responsive soils. If we add organic resources, as I just mentioned, in addition to the mineral fertilizer and the improved seeds, the response goes up even more. So the organic matter input is really essential. But if we do all three of those, and we then adapt to local conditions, and I want to add to that, if we then include the management practices that improve and support soil health, then we keep increasing the response and the efficiency of all the inputs applied. And the other important thing is, if we look at the red line, that's my last point, if we implement the practices that support soil health, then we can also move the red line up by improving the health of the non-responsive soils, making them more responsive, and moving more soils from the red line to the green line. And I want to stop with that. Thank you, James.
Thank you so much, Dr. Waise. I think for those of you who followed the proceedings at the Soil Health Summit, there was all that discussion about integrated soil health management. And there were quite a number of sessions that were looking at combinations of both organics and inorganics so that you could get higher yields. And from some of the presentations, there have even been quite a number of trials that have combined both organics and inorganics, and then there has been an uptake in terms of productivity. Now, so from what she has just presented, it also now brings in the issue of knowledge to the farmer. Because then how now do we translate this into farmers getting to know exactly what needs to be used? So at this juncture, I think from the Soil Health Summit and from the discussions that were therein, I'm going to call upon Dr. Oluwale Fatumbi. Maybe you can give us some insights about the Soil Health Summit, some of the action plans. I think we are talking about a 10-year action plan and some of the key takeaways which we can build on as Hub Agro-Dealers.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much. I will also join others to give a presentation. I have just very few slides. But while I expect the slide to come up, let me make a few statements to complement what has been said. I heard the facilitator made a statement while you are doing the introduction that we know the problems. I think we know the symptoms, but we truly do not give a lot of attention to the root cause of the problem. And that is understanding the root cause of the problem and addressing the root cause of the problem is a key impetus to proper and stable solution. I also want to thank Maria for giving that very, very detailed statistics. They are very true as it is. But you agree with me that those statistics are really, really frightening. And it's beginning to show us that if we don't take prime action now, it appears we are sitting on a gunpowder that may affect today and the posterity. Well, as it relates to the presentation of my colleague Lisa, that's also very true. And I want to pitch it from where you stopped. The need to combine organic and mineral fertilizer. I mean, it is clear that mineral fertilizer is not the devil, as some thoughts, some group, think it is. Neither organic fertilizer the saint. The two, we have to work together if we are going to get to where we want to be as it relates to maintaining soil health and having agricultural productivity in Africa. You know, it's good to just pinpoint the nature and the properties of African soil. And you need to understand that that is the oldest soil in the world. I like to repeat this everywhere I have opportunity to talk. Soil scientists will tell you that the clay minerals from the formation of African soil, they are the low activity clay minerals, the morillonite, the smectite, the kaolinite. And so what do you call it? The organic matter content is also very low, very shallow. We are talking about organic matter, the threshold is 1.5%. Do you want to compare African soil that is having far less than that, 0.9%, to soil in Ukraine and in Russia, where they are having 40% to 60%? You can quickly Google that. You will see it. It's clear. So you can't, and we know that this organic matter is the source and the sink of plant mineral. If you pour in mineral fertilizer, when the organic matter content is not optimum, it's more or less like pouring salt into a sieve and opening the tap on it. It goes away, the plant does not get it. And these are the root cause of the problem. You know, my own conclusion is that we use organic fertilizer because you already know that the nutrient content in organic fertilizer is very low, but it is rich in the colloidal properties. It is rich in humus, and we need the humus. So in Africa, my whole recommendation is that we combine the two. We apply organic fertilizer to keep the integrity of our soil in terms of humus content, and we apply mineral fertilizer to supply the nutrient need of the crop we are planting. And that gives a very strong allusion to what has been said earlier today. You know, fertilizer formulation according to the crop that you want to plant. There are more to that. Now, let me quickly tell you about the summit. This is what I've just said now as it relates to the problem. Okay? And then, 3 documents were approved. The Soil Initiative for Africa, which is a long-term framework for managing African soil in a very coherent way. And the other one is the action plan, a 10-year action plan to implement the long-term framework. They speak to one another snugly because they were co-developed by all stakeholders, including AFAP that represent the private sector group around fertilizer. Now, there was a declaration, and it is called the 2024 Nairobi Declaration on African Fertilizer and Soil Health. And this is where I want to give 3, 4, 5 minutes attention. The presidents agreed that we must triple domestic production, distribution of certified quality, organic and inorganic fertilizer by 2034, in 10 years. And it is not rocket science, it is doable if we do the right thing. The second one is that at least 70%, we should make available by 2034 targeted agronomic recommendation for specific crop soil and climatic condition to at least 70% of smallholder farmers on the continent. And that suggests that it is not just technical, it is not just business, but it is human capital development. And moderator, I want to say that the human capital development we need to do is not only to the technical fellows that are here or the businessmen, but also the civil society and everyone that uses the soil. Abuse of soil is really, really, really paramount in Africa. And I think policy incentive, there must be a carrot and rod situation. If you use the soil very well, there must be incentive for you to continue to use it. Then the third one is that we need to reverse land degradation and restore soil health on at least 30% of the degraded soil. And I think that is really very rational. It is doable. 30%, yeah, in 10 years is doable. But how do we achieve that? I mean, we can only achieve that with very smart partnership for all stakeholders across the continent, especially those who use the soil. And that makes me to think again about helping the last mile users of the soil to understand the implication of their action and inaction. If this is communicated, and it is communicated adequately, possibly we should be able to achieve this 30% in the next 10 years. Then they requested that we fully operationalize African fertilizer financing mechanism to improve production, procurement, distribution. But that is not only to mineral fertilizer. And I believe that our colleague from the African Development Bank, the AFFM director, is hearing this. There must be a way to actually leverage the AFFM also to supply the producer, distributor, and the marketers of organic fertilizer. Then we need to formulate and implement policies and regulations to create a conducive environment. We need to develop and promote systemic national capacity building for locally relevant fertilizer and soil health management. That stands at the country level. The last two is to ensure that at least 70% of the smallholder farmers have access to quality extension and advisory services on fertilizer, soil health from public and private extension system. I'm so happy listening to the last panel that talked about what the fertilizer blender manufacturers are doing in terms of capacitating even the users. But something great is still lurking there. We need to make soil information system available. We need to make it practical, not just generating maps upon maps that is not easy to interpret. We need to use ICT to ensure that soil information system is available. Then we must domesticate this at the country level. Let me now tell that there is this call to action, and I'm sure those who have access to the document will see. Now, we had the summit, and everyone is waiting for the continent to implement. How do we implement this in a coherent manner? And I listened to one of the leaders of thought on this issue, and she said, the partnership that developed the soil information system and the action plan should not be scattered. I doubt if you want to scatter a winning theme. And so this is my own thought, not necessarily the thought of the authorizing environment. Of course, African Union and NEPAD, they stand as the authorizing environment, and they are given the mandate, those big organizations are given the mandate to come up with the implementation modalities, which I think they will do shortly. But there must be continental coordination. There must be coordination of all this effort, of the different partners and stakeholders. And that's what I put in the middle there. There is going to be a need for the Secretariat. There is the need for sub-regional coordination, possibly at the regional economic community level, and that is coming up already in SADC region, in ECOWAS, it's coming up. Then the sub-regional organization, also we need to do that. But much more is the need to have implementers, organizations that run implementation. And that is what I use those big semicircle to depict for research and innovation. A handful of organizations are into that. And it is important that they form a coalition. I know that there is coalition already formed for research and innovation. And a coalition is getting formed also for policy and advocacy. Now, possibly I'm going to ask Dr. Sudukasa to quickly work on the private sector and agribusiness coalition. Organizations that work in this dimension should come together, and for advisory services, I learned AFAP is here, for education and human capital development, the likes of Ruforum, the likes of Sasakawa Global, could start that and come up with this coalition. The coalition will begin to support national partners so that they do implementations that is in sync with this, and they work around the thematic issue. I think I should stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Luale. I think you've really summarized it. And it's also a challenge to us who are seated in this forum, because there are so many takeaways, and the action plan is a really detailed action plan. There is no single organization that can undertake the activities there in the action plan. But then we also have to look in terms of where do we fit in terms of implementing, and who can be our complementary partners. Like now we have this forum here, where we have AFAP, and then we are doing in partnership with the financial institutions to provide finance. But it doesn't end there. I know we had our colleague from USAID who said we need to push fertilizer, but then it's also a challenge in AFAP. It's not just organic, it has to be inorganic as well. So even as we are talking about trade credit guarantees, where are we drawing the line? It's because we are looking all round in terms of production. Thank you very much. I think for those who don't have access to that document, if you can see Terence or anybody in AFAP, we can give you access to all the 3 documents, either by mail, and you can have full access to the declaration and the action plan. Back now to Dr. Telefone. You've had, as now an implementer, how do we domesticate now this action plan? What do we do? Maybe you can even give it from the point of view from Rwanda. Where do we pick it from here? Now the talk is over, where does the action begin? Yeah, that's it.
So I think sometimes when you stand, you may talk better. So thank you very much for this occasion of sharing my insights on the issue of status of fertilizer and soil health in Africa. The status is simple of fertilizers. Fertilizers are expensive. Full stop. That is the status. What is the status of soil health? Soil health is at the exponential graph, at exponential curve of degradation. That is the status. So I have been working with farmers for a couple of years. I really know what farmers need. But we have been having a chance that we bring on board the agro-dealers. So let us help our agro-dealers. So what are the type of game changers? So as I said, I can bring it on board on the Rwandan context. Before we complain, no fertilizers, and no what? Do we really know our soil types? Do we really know our soils? Do we really know what type of fertilizers? NPK, DAP, no way. I think that when we started those game changers, we started by providing the real information. Information is very important. So we have been working with the different projects, providing information and the evidence for improving agriculture productivity and the land use, which will guide us to have the real investment to generate economic returns on the investment. Here we're working with the private sector. What we put in, what you get out. There is no joke. And then we have to help our farmers. So generating the information on the real product, that is one of the first game changer. So the government now of Rwanda has been investing heavily in science and technology to start understanding the status of our soils. So he has been saying that soil information system, that is one of the game changer. We have been working with a different project. One is guiding acidic soil management investment in Africa. The second one is the Rwanda soil information system to make sure that we have the right recommendations of our fertilizers. So far so good. We have been collecting sample countrywide. We have been testing the formulas from different types of fertilizers and the different type of crops. What matters for rice may be differ for Irish potato. Of course, we have been working on those soil conservation techniques. But first of all, let's understand, let's know the types of soils and then the types of fertilizers we have to bring on. So who will be doing it? The second game changer is the private sector investment. We have Rwanda Fertilizer Company. They have been struggling with the investors, with the researchers, to generate the formulas for the whole country. So Rwandan soils around 50% is acidic. So most of the soil scientists, they know the challenge of acidity. You don't put anything in acidic soils without any amendment. So when the people are just saying that we need to combine mineral and what, some geopolitics, they say, oh, the good degenerative agriculture, what. But let me tell you, we have to feed our people after feeding our soils. So the amendment of our soils in Africa is very important. So investing in the private sector, we are now bringing the key players, the agro-dealers. So now, I think that now, my companies here have been complaining that they are not well in touch 100% with agro-dealers. Now the hub is coming. Thank you for inaugurating this hub. So everyone now will go work in touch in synergies. So we believe that by investing in the private sector, we will be doing a business around the type of soil and the type of fertilizers. So you can't market all of those agro-dealers will be having a knowledge and understanding on which type of fertilizer to market, but at the same time, the private sector will be aligned as well to have the good enough quantities of those fertilizers. Lastly, how do we reach farmers? The last game changer for Rwanda, digital economy. We started by, you see, when you start telling farmers you can use a phone and then you log in, you put the amount of fertilizer, everyone was complaining. Now, everyone is happy. I have been writing on the papers, ordering inputs, and then when the rain comes, those papers get lost. Now I'm passing through the digital tools. So we believe that the companies, the agro-dealers, and the farmers, through digitalization, we will be shortening the journey. So that the question I have been asking this morning, where should I get the fertilizer and at which cost, will be a game changer. So I think when I just customize those theories of change of the summit, those are the three game changers that Rwanda has been picking to move forward. And I call upon all stakeholders and all partners to join Rwanda. And then we generate those information. We generated the right fertilizers. And those amount of fertilizers that were dumping in the soil will be reduced because we will be addressing the real challenges. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think that's join me again in a round of applause for this very nice, powerful panel. And unfortunately, we shall not be taking any questions. We are running out of time. All these gentlemen and ladies are here throughout the conference this week. You can pick their brains. I'm definitely picking up the brain of my colleague here, and the gentleman across there, so you can pick their brains and engage with them throughout the conference, especially the hubs who are here, who may not even have had access to the documents or who may not have attended the Soil Health Summit. Thank you so much.
Can we also give a round of applause for our moderator? One of the reasons why we're just accelerating this session is that one of the things that you can't push too much in this type of forum is lunch and the allocation of that. So I was given a notice that we are behind and they will take all the food away, so we don't want that. One thing that I do want to point out for everyone, if you look at your badges are color-coded. And I just want to tell you what the codes are. So we have a black band for those colleagues who are with government. We have a purple band for those colleagues who are development partners. And in terms of what that might be an organization like USAID or SNV. There's three colors that are very key. Green is for colleagues who are involved in off-taking. So they're buyers, and we wanted hubs to know who they were in particular. Blue are the hub agro-dealers and the agro-dealers. So if you have a blue, and I'm saying that because you may find that you'd like to be classified with a certain color and that's not the color on your badge, so that's why I wanted to mention this. And then red are suppliers. We actually have about 12 to 15 suppliers between inorganic and organic blenders and pure manufacturers. And we invited the suppliers here because this is largely a meeting of stakeholders who create market down to the last mile, the hub agro-dealer and the agro-dealers. So as we network in the pauses, we want you to be able to identify each other, at least by color, and get closer, and then you can see what each other does. We also have pink by financial institution. Yellow are all of the organizer colleagues, so if you have questions or if you'd like to meet colleagues from AFAP, look for the yellow. And then lastly, brown are broader stakeholders. We have a number of colleagues who we've invited, colleagues who are involved with cold chain, with irrigation, with agroforestry. Those are the colleagues who we're saying are agricultural stakeholders, and we want you to be able to meet them too. So we're going to close our morning session and invite everyone to lunch. You should now have received your ticket. They came around, they look like this. If you don't have, does everybody have one of these? Okay. So lunch will be downstairs, across, and it will be open seating, or they'll have directions for us. We're going to take an hour, so by 10 minutes after 3, we want to reconvene and start the balance of the afternoon. Okay? Enjoy lunch, everyone, and we'll see you in about an hour. Thank you.